The unthinkable has happened. NATO, cornerstone of Western defense for over
After
70
2 days of
years,
intense
accepted
diplomatic
an offer
huddles,
from China.
this year's
What began as whispers in backroom corridors has now become a seismic reality. Analysts scramble, allies freeze, the world holds its breath. What does it mean? How did we get here? And what comes next? Before we dive in, don't forget to like, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's shifting power plays. Now, let's break it down. The offer. What did China propose? It began in silence, an unexpected communiqué from Beijing to Brussels. Behind closed doors, a highly encrypted document made its way through the diplomatic circuits. Labeled as a strategic cooperation framework, it quickly raised eyebrows within NATO's inner circles. What initially appeared to be a generic appeal for peaceful dialogue unfolded into something far more comprehensive and far more consequential. The offer was unprecedented in scope. China proposed a formal agreement with NATO covering 4 critical domains: cybersecurity collaboration, military transparency, peacekeeping logistics, and a potential diplomatic pathway to reduce tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Under the cybersecurity provision, China invited NATO experts to participate in bilateral forums to coordinate responses to major cyber threats. The PLA even proposed data-sharing initiatives, offering a rare look into their cyber operations, not fully open, but enough to tease trust. Military transparency meant allowing NATO observers in select PLA training drills in Xinjiang and Tibet, symbolic locations, steeped in controversy. In exchange, China wanted access to NATO logistics centers and exercises, particularly in Eastern Europe. For peacekeeping, China offered to co-deploy medical and engineering units in African hotspots where both parties had overlapping interests. While couched in humanitarian language, this hinted at a joint operational footprint, a bold move. But the real wild card? A proposal for a diplomatic working group on Taiwan. China insisted this was not about NATO recognizing its sovereignty claims, but about de-escalation. Even that symbolic gesture sent shockwaves. This wasn't just a diplomatic olive branch, it was a geopolitical gambit, and NATO now had to decide whether to play the game or fold. Why China made the move? To understand China's sudden overture, we must look beyond headlines and into the long shadows of strategy. For years, China had risen economically, building its influence through trade, infrastructure, and soft power. But diplomatically and militarily, it faced resistance. The US and its allies routinely labeled Beijing a strategic competitor. Sanctions, tech bans, and military containment had become routine. China had 2 choices: confrontation or cooperation. In 2022, NATO labeled China a systemic challenge. That single phrase sent tremors through Zhongnanhai's central headquarters of the Communist Party. It meant that NATO, a Western military alliance, had pivoted from ignoring China to preparing for it. Add to that the growing pressure from AUKUS, Quad, and Indo-Pacific alliances, and China saw itself increasingly encircled. Its response was pragmatic, not ideological. A diplomatic outreach to NATO offered multiple advantages. First, it gave Beijing legitimacy. If NATO accepted the offer, it would treat China not as an outsider, but as a player with shared global interests. Second, it provided a backdoor into Western military frameworks. Observing NATO processes, even limited, would give China invaluable insights. Third, it created friction within the West. Europe's economic reliance on China contrasted sharply with American hawkishness. Beijing knew that some NATO members, like Germany and France, favored dialogue. And lastly, it allowed China to appear reasonable to the global South. The message was clear: China wants peace. It's the West that prefers conflict. Behind the handshakes and smiles, this was strategic judo. Beijing wasn't giving up control, was extending its reach, cloaked in the language of cooperation. But the world would soon see. Whether this was a peace offering or a Trojan horse. Why NATO said yes? NATO's very DNA is rooted in skepticism, especially toward rivals like China. So why did they agree? By 2024, NATO faced mounting stress. The war in Ukraine had drained both material and political capital. cyber attacks from state-sponsored actors were escalating. Internal disputes about defense spending strained cohesion. And meanwhile, the US continued its pivot toward the Indo-Pacific, leaving Europe exposed. Enter China's proposal a wild card at a time of growing uncertainty. At first, NATO viewed the offer with suspicion. Intelligence reports flagged potential risks. But as diplomats dug deeper, they saw a potential opportunity: shape China's rise rather than react to it. China's offer wasn't just about peacekeeping or cyber drills. It was a way for NATO to project influence beyond its traditional sphere. Africa, the Middle East, even Southeast Asia regions where NATO's voice had grown quieter, but China's had grown louder. European powers, particularly France and Germany, supported exploratory talks. Their rationale? Engagement beats isolation. By accepting, NATO could create guardrails limiting China's military adventurism while gaining access to regions that matter. The US hesitated. Washington feared this was a trap, but internal pressures mounted. Congressional hearings revealed deep concerns about NATO's sustainability. The White House reluctantly approved. After months of debate, a decision was made. NATO would not enter a military alliance with China, but it would accept limited cooperation. A dangerous dance across a geopolitical minefield. And so, the agreement was signed not in triumph, but in tension. The world changed that day. You realize just how much. The immediate reactions. The world's response was swift, divided, and explosive. In Washington, headlines screamed betrayal. Pundits accused NATO of compromising Western integrity. Capitol Hill was ablaze with hearings. Some senators compared the deal to Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler. Others demanded NATO be defunded unless it reversed course. In Beijing, the state-run press celebrated the deal as a historic step toward global peace. News anchors used words like diplomatic genius and visionary statecraft, but insiders whispered of internal rifts. Some party elites feared NATO's presence would expose Chinese vulnerabilities. Europe was split. Germany and France welcomed the cooperation, calling it a bridge toward stability. The UK remained skeptical but chose pragmatism over protest. Poland and the Baltics, however, were furious. Their leaders saw China as a threat zone aligned with Russia, not the West. In emergency meetings, they demanded guarantees that NATO's core mission wouldn't be compromised. And then there was Russia. Moscow was livid. Putin denounced the deal as a betrayal of Eurasian unity. State media accused China of succumbing to Western influence. Behind closed doors, Russian diplomats reportedly stormed out of bilateral meetings with their Chinese counterparts. This single agreement had ruptured Moscow-Beijing trust, a development that sent shockwaves through their joint plans in Ukraine, Syria, and Central Asia. India, meanwhile, watched closely. Long skeptical of Chinese intentions, Delhi now wondered if its strategic calculus needed revision. Japan and South Korea convened emergency security meetings, fearing regional shifts. Taiwan felt betrayed. The presence of NATO envoys in Beijing ignited protests in Taipei. President Tsai demanded answers, fearing the island's fate was being negotiated without its consent. The strategic shift. Suddenly, the global chessboard was redrawn. Within weeks, what once seemed unimaginable became policy. NATO officers in crisp uniforms stood beside their Chinese counterparts during limited but symbolic military exercises in Western China scenes that would have been dismissed as science fiction just months prior. Chinese PLA generals, long excluded from the NATO security architecture, were now being welcomed carefully, cautiously into the logistics halls of Germany and the strategic command centers of Turkey. A new initiative emerged: cyber drills. These weren't mock battles against state actors, but rather joint operations against global ransomware syndicates. The message was clear: cybersecurity was now a shared priority, a mutual battleground. But the most controversial piece of this new alliance came in the form of shuttle diplomacy. NATO envoys, once defenders of democratic alliances, were now brokering quiet talks between Taipei and Beijing. It was meant to ease tensions, but in Taiwan, it was seen as betrayal. Protests surged in Taipei's Liberty Square. Banners declared, "We are not for sale." U.S. senators across party lines condemned NATO's overreach, calling it a violation of the alliance's founding principles. And yet, NATO's Secretary General insisted, this is dialogue, not diplomacy, prevention, not appeasement. But not everyone was convinced. Far from East Asia, Russia saw the distraction and seized the opportunity. It intensified operations in Ukraine, hoping to pull NATO's gaze back to Europe. The result was a geopolitical tug-of-war, stretching NATO's cohesion like never before. And as leaders tried to hold the line, a deeper truth began to emerge. NATO was evolving. The shape of its mission, its allies, its ideology, nothing was sacred anymore. And the world began to whisper, has NATO changed forever? The risks. China's goals were never altruistic, and NATO knew it. Behind the smiles and handshakes lay cold calculation. China didn't just want peace, it wanted power. It sought legitimacy on the world's most exclusive stage, the NATO table. A seat not just among economic giants, but military ones. A place where influence was measured not in trade, but in tanks, satellites, and nukes. From the moment the alliance began to shift, the real game began. Beijing sent silent watchers diplomats who observed every NATO meeting with calm precision. Were they just observers, or analysts gathering the West's deepest strategic insights? NATO was playing with fire and it knew it. Whispers of dissent rose from the alliance's eastern flank. Poland, with its painful memories of Soviet oppression, was wary. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania were louder, branding the cooperation a Trojan horse. Romania, caught between Russian aggression and Chinese overtures, stood uncertain. The concerns were chillingly real. Was China exploiting this deal to weaken Western unity? Would Taiwan become the bargaining chip? Could this fracture NATO itself? Even within Washington, there was growing unease. Defense officials feared a shift in U.S. strategic posture resources that once flowed into NATO were being redirected toward the Indo-Pacific. A subtle but dangerous recalibration was underway. And should the alliance waver, should it falter, China would emerge stronger, not through war, but through patience, persuasion, and pressure. What happens next? This is the question that haunts every war room, every embassy, every summit. What happens when old enemies try to become new partners? Do they find common ground or create fault lines that were never there before? Already the consequences are spreading like shockwaves. In Moscow, resentment festers. Russia, long a quiet ally of Beijing, now finds itself sidelined. A China engaged with NATO is a China less invested in its partnership with the Kremlin. Russian generals whisper of betrayal. Cyber cooperation agreements fade. A cold silence begins. In New Delhi, leaders watch with alarm. India's position, delicately balanced between East and West, is growing untenable. Should China grow too close to NATO, India may be forced to deepen its own defense partnerships with Japan, Australia, or even a new Indo-Pacific security pact. Meanwhile, the United States is rethinking everything. What does NATO mean if its traditional proposito contain the East is gone? Will future conflicts even involve Europe at all? Some call for a return to basics. Others argue for reinvention. Across Asia, the tremors continue. Japan and South Korea, once reliant on U.S. protection, begin forming independent frameworks, building fleets, expanding missile shields, calling for a new kind of alliance born not in Brussels, but in Tokyo and Seoul. And within NATO itself, a new kind of battle is underway, not of weapons, but of ideology. Some believe the world must evolve to prevent war. Others warn that embracing rivals is the surest way to invite catastrophe. Is China a friend, a rival, or something far more complicated? As of today, no one can say for certain. Thank you for watching. If this exploration challenged your thinking, if you believe the world needs deeper insight, bold analysis, and sharp coverage of geopolitics and breaking news, then please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more cinematic, thought-provoking content. Until next time, stay alert, stay informed.